What's today? August 3rd, 4th, 2012?
Today is the 4th, Saturday.
Okay,
It's Milt Williams' birthday.
okay. Well, tell us a little bit about your parents and grandparents. First of all, what is your name?
My name is Walter King Root.
Okay,
I was born in Van Nuys, LA County, California.
when?
April 11th, 1933, right after the Big Depression.
Times were tough?
Yeah, my dad was working for the YMCA, which was his career his whole life. And I just saw a movie on TV with Dana Andrews, the movie star, and he worked with my dad when we lived down in that LA area. I was impressed by that. We only lived there about a year and a half when he got the job offer to go to Tulare County, California, and we moved to Exeter, little old Exeter. And from there he ran the YMCA program in Tulare County, and Mom and I and my two brothers, George and Gene, we lived in Exeter.
How old were you? when
I
you moved
was
there?
just starting. I was about 2 years old,
Okay.
3 years old. And my dad ran the Y camp up at Sequoia Lake. And for about 10 years, I lived like a rich kid. Every summer, we got out of the heat of the San Joaquin Valley and moved up to Sequoia Lake, where he ran the Y camp program.
And so in the wintertime, he came back down, or was he up for
Yes,
year-round?
yeah, there'd be 10 feet of snow up there in the
Yeah,
wintertime.
that's right. Okay.
And my brother Gene was 7 years older than me, and my brother George was 9 years older than me. And I was in grade school, and things were just pretty normal in that respect. My dad worked with all the leaders in that whole county, who they really liked working with him in this YMCA program. And he got a lot of volunteers to work with him. And he did high Y clubs, and he did Friendly Indians, which was for the littler kids. But for that 10 years, every summer I went with Mom and Dad and the two boys up to live at Y Camp on Sequoia Lake. And the name of that camp was Camp Tulicoria, which is kind of a unique name, I guess. When I was 7 years old, I took a rowboat load of friends, about 4 friends in that boat, and they followed me as I swam across Sequoia Lake, about 2.5 miles. And my mother put an article in the newspaper that Walter King Root swam Sequoia Lake and someday will be a channel swimmer. And that's just one thing.
Did she know you were doing that?
Mom knew, but I mentioned that to my brother George one time, and he said, yeah, Dad knew about it after the fact, and he was madder than all get out. I said, well, what are you talking about? I mean, I swam the lake. I was a good swimmer at age 7, and I had a boatload of guys that were protecting me, and he said, yeah, none of those guys could swim.
Classic story.
So Dad was unhappy. But I wasn't old enough to go on pack trips, and my brother George was. And the pack trips were for like a week. They'd be way back into the Sierra Nevadas. And I was always amazed at what they did.
What were your living quarters like up there at the camp? for your family?
We lived in cabins, and all the Y Camp kids lived in cabins. And we had, when Y Camp kids were through going to camp, we'd have special groups come in. There was a women's group, secretaries from Tulare County, and they came up for a week, things like that.
Right.
But we had a hall where we all went to eat. It was a wooden building and with benches and all that. So we lived pretty good.
Did you have any friends up there? Did you have, what were your friends like growing up when you were between the ages of, say, 3 to 10?
Well, I don't remember too many friends coming up to Y Camp, but I had friends down in school, and I went back once when I was on a job down in Bakersfield. I went back to Exeter, and I met with a lady. She and another lady were living together. Their husbands had died. And I'm not sure how it worked out, but I called them and went over and sat and talked to them for about an hour. And this one girl said she was in school with me, and she could beat up every guy in our class.
And you married her? No,
And I didn't marry. I can see why I didn't marry her. But we used to play dodgeball in our school.
How many kids in your school?
Probably 500, 600.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of kids.
Yeah, there was a lot of kids.
Tell me about your health.
I had bad health. I was born with eczema all over my body, and I had asthma. And I was having troubles breathing one day in the winter time, and my mom and dad took me up to Y Camp to get me out of the valley, because we grew a lot of fruits and vegetables in that valley. It was a hot, wonderful place to grow vegetables and fruits, but all the pollens were making me have asthma. And so they took me up to Y Camp to get me out of the valley, and there was 10 feet of snow on the side of the road. And we just stayed there overnight, I think. But I was impressed with how much snow. That's a lot of snow.
Yeah.
But the Sierra Nevadas, they got a lot of snow. Anyway, it was 1941, and the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and my brother George was in high school, and he got all fired up and decided to join the Army, like so many guys did. And they accepted him. My dad, he left just before he graduated, and so my dad had to submit some paperwork to get his degree from high school. But George went into the Army, and he became my hero. And before I knew it, 6 months later, he was over on a ship getting ready to land on Normandy, the invasion of Normandy. And he was on the second day, not the first day, but the second day, landing. And he said there were bodies everywhere. A lot of guys got shot on the invasion of Europe at Normandy. And let's see.
Did you ever have to serve in the military at all?
I was called up to get a physical for Korea. It was after World War II. but because of my asthma and my skin problems and allergies, they made me 4F. But somebody had to stay behind and take care of the women.
Yeah. Okay, tell me about, did you ever do a lot with your brothers?
No, because Gene was 7 years older than me and George was 9 years older. They were best buddies, but I was kind of the little nuisance, I think.
Gotcha. Oh, let me go back a little bit. Let's talk about your asthma. What were the medications you took for asthma?
All we had was a powder that we burned in a dish. We lit it with a match, and I would inhale the smoke that came off of that medicine, and that was it.
Did it help at all?
It must have helped me a little bit because we did it several times. But we didn't have inhalers in those days.
Right. Well, I've always heard the story about the asthma dwarfs or whatever you called them.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, for Christmas, we used to go down to Santa Rosa, where Grandma and Grandpa lived, and all the siblings, and we'd gather for Christmas. Well, that powder that I told you about, my mother would burn in a dish. We could buy those called Asthmador cigarettes, and it was that medicine that was in half of the cigarette, and the other half was a tube, an empty tube, but you'd smoke it like a regular cigarette. And one time I got asthma really bad down in Santa Rosa because my uncle, where we met with the family, he owned a chicken hatchery. And boy, that just triggered me. I got asthma so bad. So Mom and Dad put me on a bus going back to Boise, Idaho, where we had moved. And I had asthma real bad, so every time the bus stopped at a bus stop, the guys would get off the bus and go into the restroom and light up their cigarettes. And so I did too. I went in because of my asthma. I lit up those cigarettes. And a guy came up to me once and he said, "Hey kid, what are you smoking?" Nowadays, it would be weed, and all kinds of stuff. But in those days, there was just regular cigarettes and then me and my Asthmador. So I remember that.
So you were born in Van Nuys. You went up to Exeter. You spent summers up at Sequoia. When did you move to Boise? Was that the next place you lived?
No, George went into the Army. That left me and Gene behind with Mom and Dad. And Dad was offered the job down in Phoenix. And he took it, and we left Exeter and moved to Phoenix. And down there we had an old beat-up swamp cooler for air conditioning. And we used to lay in bed with just our underwear on and sweat like crazy. Arizona was terrible. And after a year and a half of that, my mother complained so bad with my dad that they decided to leave. And he accepted the YMCA director's job up in Boise, Idaho.
About what year was that?
Well,
after the war?
no, the war was still on.
Okay, so in the early 40s.
In fact, we had a half-track factory right by us at Phoenix, and I was impressed with that. And I had two Chinese friends of mine that I used to play with in Phoenix, and a Mexican boy and a black fellow, and we had kind of a gang because the war was on. We had wooden rifles, and we formed a Chinese guerrilla group and played war games. And I really enjoyed those. There was John and Don were the Chinese boys that were our leaders. Oswald Oswald Rodriguez was my buddy, who was a Mexican boy. And so I had some good friends, but we only stayed a couple of years, then we moved to Boise.
Okay, so in the 40s, you moved to Boise. You're a young boy, and you stayed in Boise until you were married and moved to Salt Lake.
Yeah. Boise was, when we first came in from Phoenix and hit the suburb of Boise, Boise was gorgeous. You drive down into the valley there, and the name Boise means Valley of Trees or City of Trees, and it was wonderful. And the area secretary for the YMCA at that time had procured a house for my dad and mom and me and Jean. George was still in the war over in Europe. And so we moved to Boise, and it was probably 45 when I was going to junior high.
Okay.
And
Boise Junior High, is that what it was called?
North Junior High.
North Junior High.
Yeah, 3 years. And I started having a lot of friends, girlfriends, boyfriends, and Boise was really pleasant. And my dad had pretty good success. He traveled a lot, forming high Y clubs in high schools around the valley, all the way over to Oregon border, Ontario and La Grande. And so he was gone a lot, and I got to start with an old C melody saxophone my Uncle Joe King.
Okay, so you were in junior high.
Yeah, I just started junior high, 7th grade, and met a lot of new friends because we just moved to Boise. And it was a fun time. And I was able to play some musical programs with this C melody saxophone that Uncle Joe gave my folks. And I played basketball. So it was the beginning of my athletic career, really. But junior high was junior high. Nothing really fantastic until we started going to Boise High School. And then I really started enjoying my friends there. 3 years, 10th, 11th, and 12th in Boise High School. And I played in the concert band with, I traded my C melody saxophone for an E-flat alto saxophone and played in the concert band, and was second chair until I was a senior, and then I was first chair. And I started playing JV basketball, and they moved me up to varsity basketball as a junior. So I was having some success there. And to make a long story short, when I was a senior, at the end of the season, I was asked to join the All-Stars. So I made All-State in high school basketball.
Wow.
I played in a dance band called the Cadets, and I really enjoyed that.
Did you stay in touch with those people for a while after?
Oh yeah. And so that was kind of an exciting time in my life. And then my brother George came home from the war, and he went up to Moscow, Idaho for the University of Idaho. And my brother Gene went to Boise Junior College. I was still in high school. And all three of us ended up going to the University of Idaho at Moscow.
Do you remember your address where you lived growing up when you were in Boise?
Yeah, we lived at 1214 North 19th Street, on 19th Street. And I knew a couple of guys in the high school, Bruce Williams and Roger Williams, but I didn't know they had a runny-nosed little sister who I fell in love with.
How did you meet her?
I came back down from Moscow during a football game, and she was a cheerleader for the Boise High football team, along with Judy Voighton, and the two of them were cheerleaders, and I was really impressed. And Linda, she got a scholarship from the newspaper to be a reporter, and she went up to Moscow, and that's where we met, was during an exchange from her Hayes Hall dormitory to where I lived at Chrisman Hall dormitory. And I was a hasher. We served food, to everybody that ate there. And I served her, and I've been serving her ever since.
I don't know if I agree with that, but I think she's been serving you. But so, what did you say to her? Did you just ask her on a date, or what'd you do?
Yeah, I asked her on a date, and we went out for a Coke to a cafe called Johnny's Cafe, and that was the beginning of our romance. But I had a problem. I was playing in a dance combo, and she was footloose and fancy-free, dating guys. And I'll never forget the time when she was dancing with this one guy, and she kept getting him to dance by the bandstand where I was playing my saxophone. And I don't know, she was teasing me, I guess. But she was a beautiful girl. She ran for Miss Boise, and I think she was a runner-up. She was a reporter for the Idaho Statesman, and her dad was Joe Williams, and he became the state auditor and was in office over 30 years, longer than any other person in the state of Idaho in an elected position. And they named a state office building after him, the Joe R. Williams State Office Building.
Back in the 90s, huh?
Really impressive.
Well, tell me about Joe and Lorraine Williams. When you, I assume Mom brought you home once, and they found out you were not a Mormon. So then, how did that all go?
Yeah. Well, we were dating for about a year and a half up in Moscow. We used to, we had a favorite dance place. I was trying to remember, it was called the Dipper, I guess. And I'll tell you, I fell in love with that girl. We used to dance and dance and dance. We danced to the music of the Four Freshmen and the big bands, Tommy Dorsey. And we went on dates when the big bands came in. And so we had about a year and a half of just special falling in love type stuff. And when I was a senior, I was interviewed by the representative from Owens Corning Fiberglass, and he offered me a job. So I had a job lined up when I was a senior in engineering. I took civil engineering and I took an extra year of business courses, marketing and psychology of persuasive speech and things like that. And I proposed to Linda that we get married because I was ready to graduate and I had a job, I had a contract to go down to the Bay Area in California where the plant was. And she accepted. We got married in Boise at her home. And because I was not a Mormon, we couldn't get married in the temple. But we got married in Boise, and a year later, we were married in the temple. We went down to Salt Lake with Joe and Lorraine.
So you became converted shortly
Yeah.
after? Did you become converted because you were in love, or was it, did you have
Yeah.
a little bit of...
No, I was baptized by Stan Tanner's dad up in Moscow. He was the institute director, and Bob Biggs, my friend. They took me down into the baptismal waters and all white clothes, white socks, white shoes, white shirt, jumpsuit, and laid me under the water, and I was baptized. And a story I like to tell is when I walked back up out of the baptismal font, I looked back down and the water was brown. And I said, baptism really works. It washed all my sins away, if I had any. And I kept telling people, I said, I believe in baptism. It washes away your sins. And when I said that, they said, well, Brother Root, and I said, I believe it. I believe in baptism. And they said, Brother Root, there's one thing we should tell you. We've had problems with the pipes. They've been filled with rust, I guess.
Tell me about the proposal to Mom. Did you just kind of casually say, let's get married, or did you?
Yeah, it was kind of that way. She was hesitant because I was a Presbyterian. I was singing in Moscow. I was singing in the Presbyterian church choir. And, but I said, I want to get married and I will join your church. And I liked the attributes of the Mormon church. I didn't smoke and I didn't drink and I didn't use vulgar language. And so the thing, my attitude and my way of life fit beautifully into the Mormon church. And so we got married and we moved to California when I graduated in June, and we were all set. Moved down to San Jose, and Laurie was born there. I had worked for Owens Corning Fiberglass, and I commuted into San Francisco in the contractor estimating division. And we lived there about a year when I got an offer to go up to Seattle and fill in a position up there. So I went to Linda and I, and Laurie was born. She was born that first year down in California, and the three of us moved up to Seattle. And I decided I didn't like the contracting end of the business. I wanted to get into the sales and marketing end. And they finally found me. We lived up in Seattle for a couple of years, and they found a job opening down in Boise, Idaho. And boy, I really talked like a Dutch uncle to get that position. And I got it. So we moved back to Boise the old hometown. And that's where Camille was born and Christopher was born while we lived in Boise. And
Do you remember when, what's your wedding date?
we were married in December of 1955.
And then married in the temple about a year later?
I had to wait a year before I could get married in the LDS temple.
And what did your parents think about you joining the LDS church?
They weren't too hot on that. My mother had quit going to church, the Presbyterian church. Somebody had made her unhappy. So during that time, I went to church with my dad. He was a good, faithful churchgoer as the head of the YMCA, but he taught me how to sing bass. My dad was 6'7", and he sang a nice bass. He had a nice bass voice. And by the way, I always looked up to my dad because I was only 6 feet tall, and he was 6'7". But they weren't anti. My dad got into a lot of trouble over in southeast Idaho. A Mormon guy kind of attacked him and said, "We don't want you over here." And so he backed away from organizing high white clubs over in that Idaho Falls, Pocatello area, which was real strong Mormon country from the church in Salt Lake City. But he was busy with like Twin Falls and Mountain Home and Boise and on up to Nampa and Caldwell, on up to Ontario, Oregon, and he was organizing high Y clubs.
What do you do at a high Y club?
Well, it was a club for high school kids, a social club with religious background, and they would have lunches and talk about spiritual things, and that was the way my dad lived. All the years of his life, he never worked for anybody else but the YMCA. The YMCA stands for Young Men's Christian Association. And where we lived down in California, it was really strong with Christian attributes. But when we moved up to Boise, it was more of a health club, and is known now, I think, as the YMCA health clubs. They have swimming pools and family tickets you can buy to take your family swimming. And so it became, to me, as I look back, it became more of a health club. I was a lifeguard at the YMCA there in Boise. A friend of mine and I, Jerry White, and the two of us were lifeguards down there. And we had swimming classes of maybe 50, 60 kids when it was their time to come swimming. So that was kind of my background along with my dad. But I never smoked, I never drank. My dad was a teetotaler, good old Presbyterian. And he came from a Protestant background, and he was disappointed that I would join the Mormon church. But I've been a good person ever since, so I think where my two brothers went in the Army and learned how to smoke and drink, I never did. My brother Gene died at the age of 51. He was a heavy smoker, and those cigarettes, they took their toll on him. he never married. So I don't know how my dad felt about him as a person. But anyway, that's a little bit of the history. I sang with a group when we moved from Seattle down to Boise. I sang with a group called the Mormonaires, and I played in a dance combo for a lot of dances. Mormons were great at dancing. They loved to dance, and so I was playing in a little dance combo with my saxophone, and that was kind of our life. And Christopher was born in Boise while we were living there. I had tried to leave Owens Corning and go to work for a contractor there in Boise, and it didn't work out. So I went to work for an office supply house called Finch's, and I didn't like that either. So I applied for the sales position in Salt Lake City for Guston Bacon fiberglass. They were just like my old Owens Corning people. And while I was working, I accepted that job, and we moved down to Salt Lake, and that's where Scott was born. So we had 4 children, had a good job. I was district sales engineer, and while I was working for Guston Bacon, all the guys I worked with in Owens Corning were laid off. They closed down Owens Corning. They had a big stock fight with a lumber yard over in Colorado, and it got everybody fired. But I had gone to work for Guston Bacon, and I worked for them for about 5 or 6 years, and they decided to sell out to a large manufacturer, and that's when I started Root Industries. I was a manufacturer's rep, and I had about 5 companies that I represented. And with guys losing their jobs all around me, I felt like that was the best thing I could do, and it worked out pretty good for me. So we live in Salt Lake City, 2839 Cherry Blossom Lane, and I've raised 4 children, and we lived happily ever after.
Well, you lived in the Mill Creek area, 3144 Celeste Way,
Yes.
from about 1963 till about 1975, isn't that right?
Yeah, and we moved in 74 is when my dad died, and we decided to move 75 to our home over in on Cherry Blossom, which had a big swimming pool, and we're still living there.
Well, I want to go back. We still have like about 20 minutes, something like that, if that's okay, before this is over, and we'll call it good. But what do you know about your ancestors, how they came over here? I mean, who were they?
Well, joining the LDS Church, they really promote the idea of tracing your genealogy. And I have done Mormon genealogy work for all of my ancestors, my grandma and grandpa on both sides of the family, back about 6 generations. I've done temple work and had them sealed and endowed, baptized and endowed, and sealed to each other, sealed to their parents. And I believe in that. That's a big portion of the way a Mormon lives. And I have come to find that Grandpa Root, who lived in Topeka, Kansas, was a very qualified man. He was the head of the Kansas State Historical Society for many years. And his father, who he worked for,
Frank Albert, is that, no, Frank?
Frank Root,
Yeah, Frank Root.
was in charge of the, this was before the railroads, was in charge of the freighting and the Pony Express business. That was the only way going west that people could travel or send mail or ship anything. And in the middle of all his work, great-grandpa's work, the trains started up, and the railroads met in Utah, and that put the
Overland stage.
Pony Express out of business. So that was the end of the stage work.
But he wrote a book about the Overland stage.
Yeah, he wrote a book. It's about 2 inches thick, and he arranged for freighting to the various stage line terminals into Colorado and over the Rockies. He arranged a lot of freighting for the Mormons in Utah, and so that was really quite an interesting, to me it was interesting that he worked at that business.
Right.
So in doing genealogy work, that was a very interesting book of how he worked with people, including the Mormons.
And I think it was actually called The Overland Stage, wasn't it?
Yeah, to
By
California.
Frank, by
The
Frank
Overland
Root.
Stage to California by Frank Root.
Now, you told me in the past that you have some family that's royalty that moved out to the plains of Oregon, you know, a big
Well,
contrast.
that was my other grandma and grandpa. And while Mormons were going out to Utah, they stayed on the Overland Trail and went to Oregon, where they established a ranch and lived there for a number of years. Several of their children were born there. So that was kind of interesting. They first pushed 2 chicken houses together to live in that area east of Portland. And the genealogy that I have in my possession of where Grandma King lived in England, they were very, very wealthy. The Prideaux family, that was her maiden name, and they own wharfs and docks in England, and so they were very wealthy people. And for her to marry Grandpa King and go out to America and live and pioneer up in Oregon, what a change.
And
What
she
a
didn't bring her money with her.
Well, they had access to her mother and dad, and that's another story. When I moved with Linda to Salt Lake City, I auditioned for the Mormon Tabernacle Choir.
Why did you want to do that?
Well, because I'd been singing. I sang with the Mormonaires up in Boise, Idaho, and I've been singing in dance bands and dance combos, and I wanted to sing.
And you'd heard the choir, you really loved their music.
I heard the choir and was thrilled by the way and the numbers they sang.
How did you find out how to audition?
Well, Mary Squires was a friend of ours next to us there in on Celeste Way when we moved to Salt Lake, and she was in the Tabernacle Choir, and I kept asking her, "How do I get in? What do I have to do?" And she said, "Well," and she lined it up, told me what I should do, and so I auditioned, and I made the choir. And so I sang with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir and traveled all over the world with Linda and me in the choir for 20 years. Wonderful life, wonderful experiences.
What were some of the areas you traveled to?
Well, without Linda, I went to Mexico City where we put on an area conference. I went with Linda to Japan where we put on area conferences. I went with Linda to France, England, and France. In England, we put a concert on in the Royal Albert Hall, which is very famous. We went over to Paris, and we saw the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe. Went over to Salzburg, where the Sound of Music. Linda and I traveled with friends over there. Oh, it was really exciting. And traveling with the choir and with friends made it very easy and very enjoyable. So that was my experience. 20 years. They have a 20-year limit or age 60 that you will meet, and you'll have to leave the choir if you're age 60. I played a lot of basketball. Played church basketball, and I got the bruises to show for it. And when I moved down here, when we were in Boise, I played for our ward basketball team, and we beat everybody in that area up there. So we went to the All Church down at Brigham Young University to play in the All Church Basketball League. And they don't do that anymore, but that was exciting. And when we moved to Salt Lake City, I played on church basketball teams until I was 53 years old. It was a good way of life.
Tell me about, let's go back a little bit, talk about maybe what was your first car?
Well, my first car, we only had one car in the family up in Boise. It was a Studebaker, a 1941 Studebaker, and we put about 250,000 miles on it. And Dad never had a lot of money, but I had a motor scooter when I was in high school. But I had a girlfriend in high school, but you can't date on a motor scooter, so I asked her dad if I could borrow his Buick to take his daughter out. And that never developed for very much, but we were a one-car family. And Dad decided to trade that car in on another Studebaker. He loved Studebakers. So I drove that car, and one summer when we were going to Moscow, I accepted a job down in Rupert, Idaho with two friends of mine. And we ran the swimming pool there all summer long. And I started a swim team. They had never had a swim team. And we took the swim team up to Boise, where we entered in a state swim meet, and we took 4th place of all the cities in the state, which I felt was really, really good. Had a lot of wonderful kids that swam in that swim pool there in Rupert. let's see, what else was I talking about?
You were talking about your
oh.
swimming.
Yeah, my buddy who was the manager of the pool, he wanted to get rid of his 56 Ford and get a newer Ford. And that car I grabbed and lived with for I don't know how many years, dating with Linda. When we got married, we drove it to California, we drove it to Seattle, and that was probably my most favorite car ever.
Wow.
Four-door Ford, 56 Ford.
Okay, how about some other questions? Have you met anybody famous? Have you ever almost lost your life? I mean, there's a lot of things we could talk about.
Well, we used to have people come when I was in the Tabernacle Choir. Linda worked in the Beehive House as a tour guide for the church. And she met famous people that wanted to see about what Brigham Young was all about. And she was a tour guide at the Beehive House while I was in the Tabernacle Choir. And we had people come and visit the Tabernacle Choir. A lot of them came on Thursdays when we had rehearsals, and people who were famous singers, movie stars.
Presidents?
We had, I was trying to remember if we had any presidents come.
That's okay.
Can't think of, but we met a lot of movie stars that came through Salt Lake and wanted to hear the Tabernacle Choir.
Okay, let's see what else. But I mean, we've got, looks like about 8 minutes left. What would you want all of your posterity to know about Walt Root, or your family, or whatever, before you?
Well, my posterity is Laurie's my oldest daughter, and Camille's my next older daughter, and then Christopher's my oldest son, and Scott is my youngest son. And all four of those children I hoped would be good people. And I tried to get them to be good Latter-day Saints, and didn't do a very good job there because my two daughters married guys that were not LDS, so that was a hardship. But my two sons became very active in the church, in the priesthood, and I've always been proud of Chris and Scott, and the women they married and the families that they've had have been an inspiration to me.
Better say something good about your daughters too, though.
Yeah.
You know, I'm disappointed in them.
Well, just in the respect of them joining the church, they are powerhouses. Laurie and her husband built a hotel down in Barbados. That was an amazing experience. Camille worked for a mobile home manufacturing company, and she was #2 salesperson in the United States. So it gives you an idea what those two girls were like. And Laurie had 2 boys, and Camille had 3. And we used to call those 5 boys the Nazis in our family. Because there were 5 boys that when they got together, they would change the world if they could. It was really quite an experience. And my oldest son, Chris, he had 3 beautiful daughters. No sons, 3 beautiful daughters, which we really enjoyed. Now my youngest son, he got married and had a daughter who became quite a movie star in her own in high school productions, singing and dancing. That's Danielle. And then Scott had a son by the name of Josh, and he's been a real inspiration. And then Scott had another daughter named Quinn, and she is a tornado, and she loves to swim in our swimming pool.
That's right. That's right. Okay, let's. We only have really about 3 or 4 minutes. Golly, I don't know. What do you want to talk about for 3 or 4 minutes?
Well, I've been a good man. I became a convert to the church, and I've been an elder in the church, and I became a 70, and I've been on 2 missions. The 20 years I sang with the Tabernacle Choir was a mission call. And then when they graduated me from the Tabernacle Choir, I became a 70 and a missionary doing door-to-door proselyting. So I've had 2 missions in the church, which I feel good, and now I've kind of settled back being an old high priest with a lot of stories to tell.
Okay. I know there's a million things we could talk about. You know, well, your hobbies. Did you hunt? Did you fish? You know, did you do artwork? We know you sang. That was a big part of your.
I did a lot of singing, and I sang for weddings. I sang for the Tabernacle Choir. I put on the Walt Root Show, and invited a lot of older people who like Frank Sinatra songs, and I've kind of stopped doing that, but I would invite people to come and join me to help put on the Walt Root Show. And I would, like Churchill Junior High up here, I invited their 60 swing dancers from the junior high, and we put on a show with them. Just things like that were really, I've had 3 Miss Utahs come and perform with me on my Walt Root Show. One was a professional dancer, and the other 2 were singers. One was the best singer on the Miss America contest and the talent show, and she lived here in Salt Lake, and I had her sing with me. So that was kind of a fun part of my life, putting on musical shows.
But you still I know you took your boys hunting and fishing.
Yeah, I didn't really care to kill too much. We used to do a bunch of fishing. We've gone deer hunting a few times.
Pheasant hunting and
Pheasant
Hungarian
hunting,
partridge hunting and
partridge hunting, yeah. A little bit when we moved here to Salt Lake City.
all right. Well, I think we're about to the end of the tape, so thank you, and maybe we'll do a part 2. Who knows? But
Today is October 3rd.
not October 3rd.
Excuse me,
August 4th.
August 4th today, 2012.
There you go. All right. Say goodbye.
Talk to you later.
Okay.